On the crisp morning of November 29th, 1963, Carlos Marcello stirred awake, adhering to his customary routine. Like clockwork, he preferred to rise before the clock struck 6. Before stepping out of bed, a gentle kiss on his wife's cheek marked the start of his day. Swiftly dressing himself, he proceeded to prepare his morning repast, ensuring that the day began on a savory note. By the time the clock reached 7 in the morning, Carlos Marcello was impeccably attired, poised to embark on the day's endeavors. A farewell kiss exchanged with his wife served as a silent promise, and with that, he ventured into the outside world. The engine of his car roared to life, carrying him away from the comforts of home to the hub of his operations at the town and country motel. Another day in the life of Carlos Marcello unfolded as he navigated the bustling streets, a man of routine, embracing the rhythm of his existence. However, on this particular day, a subtle undercurrent of tension lingered in the air. Just a week earlier, a man with intricate ties leading back to Carlos Marcello, facilitated through figures like David Ferrie and Guy Bannister, had perpetrated the unthinkable, an assassination of the United States President. The streets of New Orleans hummed with conversation, and the name Jack Ruby reverberated through the city, unveiling connections to both the New Orleans and Chicago underworlds. As the city buzzed with speculation, the people of New Orleans reminisced about the days when David Ferrie, Guy Bannister, and the enigmatic Lee Harvey Oswald were intertwined in a complex web. Whispers traversed the streets, carrying tales of their connections to the New Orleans underworld. Those who lived through those tumultuous days held a collective memory, acknowledging the intertwining relationships between David Ferrie, Guy Bannister, and the infamous Carlos Marcello. In the midst of these hushed conversations, a peculiar detail emerged: the knowledge that David Ferrie had found himself in court alongside Carlos Marcello, on the very day of the fateful assassination, standing alongside Guy Bannister. The intricate web of connections in New Orleans became even more apparent as people delved into the details. Whispers circulated about the unions overseeing Jack Ruby's strip clubs, firmly tying back to Carlos Marcello's brother. The grapevine suggested that Ruby engaged in discussions with Marcello's brother, seeking resolutions to financial predicaments and perhaps hoping for leniency from the formidable New Orleans crime family. Adding another layer to the unfolding narrative, there were talks about Guy Bannister, a figure closely associated with Lee Harvey Oswald. Multiple sightings placed Oswald in Bannister's offices, fueling speculations about their ties. Interestingly, another powerful figure, Carlos Marcello, was also glimpsed within the confines of Guy Bannister's domain. Marcello, however, provided a justification. He claimed that Bannister was aiding him in his legal battle against the Immigration Department. As the city buzzed with these revelations, the streets of New Orleans became a tapestry woven with threads of clandestine meetings, financial dealings, and legal maneuvers. What unfolds before you is a window into the past, a glimpse through the lens of Life magazine, a publication that etched the events of the Kennedy assassination just 1 week after that fateful day. This unique edition stands out, for it was among the few that dared to imprint frames from the Zapruder film directly onto its pages. In those dark rooms where mob bosses like Carlos Marcello dwelled, this magazine likely served as a clandestine portal, offering a visual narrative of the ominous day that changed the course of history. One can envision Marcello scrutinizing each frame, absorbing the gravity of the tragedy that unfolded. As we delve into the narrative of Carlos Marcello, it becomes evident that Life magazine inadvertently stepped into the fray of organized crime's war. Marcello, the final mob boss in our exploration, holds a pivotal role, not just in the criminal underworld, but in the annals of justice. The very essence of our journey lies in understanding why Marcello became the linchpin, the catalyst for the FBI and the entire Justice Department to alter their strategies against the mafia. Kennedy's relentless pursuit had hit the mafia like a freight train, an assault that shook the foundations of their clandestine empire. However, the aftermath saw the battleground shift to the shadows, where surveillance and intelligence gathering became the weapons of choice. The goal was to dismantle the mafia, but the revelation came too late. Life magazine, in its quest for truth, inadvertently added pressure to the establishment. In 1963, it marked the beginning of a complex story, and by 1967, it would escalate into a full-blown war with Carlos Marcello at its epicenter. Life magazine, alongside Time and other publications, intensified their scrutiny on Marcello, making him the focus like no other mob boss in that era. The intensity of the years 1967, 1968, and 1970 plunged the world into a state of heightened scrutiny, especially for figures like Carlos Marcello. Feeling the heat, Marcello strategically mobilized his contacts, including the likes of Jim Garrison and others, to wage legal battles against Life magazine. In a bold move, they even approached the very offices of Life magazine, seeking to uncover the depth of information the publication possessed. What unfolded in those tense meetings struck fear into the hearts of Marcello's camp. The revelations held by Life magazine were evidently potent, to a degree where legal cases against the publication were dropped swiftly. The ominous knowledge within those pages became a bargaining chip that compelled Marcello's associates to retract their legal actions. Curiously, despite the legal maneuvers and the unsettling revelations, no tangible repercussions befell Carlos Marcello. The publications might have exposed the intricacies of his world, but Marcello, the enigmatic figure at the center of it all, eluded the grasp of justice. As the legal storm subsided, Marcello remained a free man, navigating the next decade with an uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of the consequences that loomed over his shadowy empire. The dance between organized crime and the forces seeking to bring it to justice continued, with Marcello remaining an elusive figure on the fringes of both worlds. As we follow the investigative threads, it becomes clear that the echoes of Kennedy's assassination resound with the name Carlos Marcello, a pivotal figure in the clandestine war that unfolded behind closed doors. Here is the complete article for you to experience firsthand what Marcello and the entire nation would have been immersed in on November 29, 1963. In the hallowed silence following the assassination, Life magazine played the role of Marcello's guardian, a keeper of secrets that for a moment shielded the puppet master from the harsh light of scrutiny. The orchestrated omission of damning connections ensured Marcello's grip on the shadows, where his dealings with the New Orleans Mafia, the Chicago outfit, and clandestine rendezvous with figures like Sam Giancana and the Campisi family remained obscured in the murky depths of intrigue. The plot thickens as we scrutinize the pages of this magazine, printed a mere week after the Kennedy assassination. It's a curious omission that amidst the revelations and images from the Zapruder film, there's a stark silence on certain critical elements. The intelligence agencies and the FBI, key players in this labyrinthine tale, remain conspicuously absent from the narrative. David Ferry, a shadowy figure intertwined with the events, is brushed aside, and the enigmatic Guy Bannister is also brushed aside. Life magazine's ink fails to illuminate the connections and potential roles these individuals might have played in the grand tapestry of the Kennedy assassination. And then there's Jack Ruby, a name that echoes in the annals of crime, yet the magazine merely glosses over his identity. Now in the sunny freshness of a Texas morning, with roses in her arms and a luminous smile on her lips, Jacqueline Kennedy still had 1 hour to share the buoyant surge of life with the man at her side. It was a wonderful hour. Vibrant with confidence, crinkle-eyed with an all-embracing smile, John F. Kennedy swept his wife with him into the exuberance of the throng at Dallas's love field. This was an act in which Jack Kennedy was superbly human. Responding to the warmth his own genuine warmth evoked in others, he met his welcomers joyously, hand to hand and heart to heart. For him, this was all fun as well as politics. For his shy wife, surmounting the grief of her infant son's recent death, This mingling demanded a grace and gallantry she soon would need again. Then the cavalcade, fragrantly laden with roses for everyone, started into town. 8 miles on the way, in a 6th-floor window, the assassin waited. All the roses, like those here abandoned in Vice President Johnson's car, were left to wilt. They would be long faded before a stunned nation would fully comprehend its sorrow. On these and the following 2 pages is a remarkable and exclusive series of pictures, which show, for the first time and in tragic detail, the fate which befell our president. The caravan had just passed through the downtown area of Dallas and made a sharp left turn at the corner of Elm and Houston Streets, where it headed down an incline into an underpass. First came the police motorcycle escort, and then the big Lincoln, bearing the Kennedys and Texas Governor John Connally and his wife. The crowds were thin at this point, but the President and Mrs. Kennedy were smiling and waving as their car passed the brick building where the assassin lurked and disappeared momentarily behind a highway sign. Then came the awful moment. In these pictures, which run consecutively from left to right, it begins as the car comes out from behind the sign. The President's wave turns into a clutching movement toward his throat. Governor Connally, who glances around to see what has happened, is himself struck by a bullet and slumps over. As the President's car approaches a lamppost, Mrs. Kennedy suddenly becomes aware of what has happened and reaches over to help, while Governor Connally slumps to the floor. The President collapses on his wife's shoulder, and in the last 2 small pictures, the First Lady cradles him in her arms. "Oh no, oh no," Mrs. Kennedy cries, as she sees the blood flowing from the President's head. But the convoy keeps going, past the onlookers and photographers who stand frozen or fall to the ground as they hear the shots. As the President lies dying, Jackie scrambles out of her seat and crawls onto the trunk of the car in a pathetic search for help. As she crouches on hands and knees, the President's head presses against her, staining her skirt and stockings with blood. A Secret Service man leaps on the bumper to protect the First Lady and get her back into the car. The words of the oath hauntingly echoed that sparkling and festive inauguration day which all 3 had attended 35 months before. In the cramped compartment of the presidential plane Air Force One, the new First Lady and the widowed one listened in the privacy of their thoughts. With his right hand raised and his left upon a Bible, Lyndon Baines Johnson became the 36th President of the United States. Then he turned quietly and said, "Okay, let's get this plane back to Washington." Only 2 hours earlier, Johnson had been riding through Dallas, 2 cars behind the limousine carrying President Kennedy. Then came the shots, and the motorcade sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. There the Secret Service closed in on Lyndon Johnson, and he walked into the hospital. When he came out some minutes later, he, in fact, the unsworn president. From the hospital he was rushed to the presidential plane at Love Field. After Jacqueline Kennedy and her husband's casket had come aboard, the swearing-in took place. 2 hours and 21 minutes later. The plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. The new president and his lady stepped forward to the waiting microphones. "I will do my best," he said. "That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." Then Johnson went to the White House, where John Kennedy's Oval Office would soon be emptied for him. Jacqueline Kennedy was sitting beside her husband when he was shot. She held him in her arms in the desperate dash to the hospital. She was with him when they put his body in the casket in Dallas. And there she said farewell with a kiss and slipped the wedding band from her own finger onto his. Her hand lightly touched the casket as it was carried to an ambulance in Dallas, and she refused to leave it even long enough to alight from the presidential plane in Washington by the passenger ramp. Instead, she stayed with it on the cargo lift, which lowered the casket to the ground, and jumped down herself, hand in hand with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to ride with it to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and back at last to the White House. Never, in that long, long afternoon and night, did she leave him, even to change the blood-stained suit she wore away from Dallas. Her hand lightly touched the casket as it was carried to an ambulance in Dallas, and she refused to leave it even long enough to alight from the presidential plane in Washington by the passenger ramp. Instead, she stayed with it on the cargo lift, which lowered the casket to the ground, and jumped down herself, hand in hand with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to ride with it to Bethesda Naval Hospital and back, at last, to the White House. Never, in that long, long afternoon and night, did she leave him, even to change the blood-stained suit she wore away from Dallas. No bugler sounded taps, no drum beat its ruffle, no band pealed hail to the chief as John F. Kennedy, 35th the President of the United States, returned for the last time to Washington, the city where he practiced the magic art of leadership. It was 17 years ago he came here from Boston, and in the years since, his arrivals and departures came to punctuate the telling of American history. When he arrived, the door would open, and the little figure would come out to give that graceful wave of the arm, which became the most familiar flourish in American politics. There would follow then the burst of applause, the shouts and yells, the oohs and ha's as he tripped down the stairs with that light, graceful step which was his style. But he came this time in silence. The faint shrills of distant jets, the sputter and cough of belly-lighted helicopters carrying the men of power from Washington onto the field, the subdued conversation, all made the silence larger. It was moist and chilly, and the twilight bars of pink had just given way to a quarter moon hung with mist. When Air Force No. 1, the presidential jet, silently rolled up the runway from the south, the pilot in his cockpit must have sensed the hush so skillfully had he stilled the motors. So surprisingly did the plane appear in the total glare of the lights and soundlessly come to a stop. It was the minutes past 6 in the afternoon. One wished for a cry, a sob, a wail, any human sound. But the plane, white with long blue flashings, rested under the punishment of the light, sealed and silent. A great cargo lift, glistening yellow on the outside, dazzling white on the inside, framed with lights of red and white, rolled as far as the plane, and paused. A door opened in the rear of the plane. A man appeared, and for a moment it was as it always had been. Larry O'Brien's round face peered out first, but O'Brien stooped down and, as he moved, lifted something. For the first time the ugly glint of the dark red bronze box showed. Behind O'Brien was Dave Powers, and then Kenny O'Donnell. These men had followed him from Boston to Washington and across the land, carrying his papers, his coats, his briefcase. This time, in last service, they carried the president himself. They set the coffin down gently on the floor of the room-sized lift. It jounced, then steadied, then began to settle to the ground quietly, with its burden and those from the plane who accompanied it. An honor guard of 6 reached out their hands to receive the coffin. The bearers bent to hand it down to them. It shook in the passing over, and O'Brien's hand, almost caressing, reached out as if to steady a fragile thing or a tumbling child. Then, not being needed any more, the hand fluttered uselessly in the air. There were, still, no voice audibles, except those of the broadcasters pattering as quietly as possible into their microphones. The silhouettes at the edge of the lift, cut sharp by the light, parted, and a slender woman in a rose-colored suit with dark facing appeared, then hovered at the lip of the low platform. Bobby Kennedy was there, lifting up his arms to help her down, then guiding her into the grey service ambulance with the red dome light steady, not winking. Mrs. Kennedy's hand tried to open the ambulance door and fell limply. Bobby leaned forward, opened the door, guided her in. Then silently, the ambulance rolled onto the north and was gone. One watched and knew the nation was watching, and behind the lights watched the true government of the United States. There they stood, the young and old McNamara of defense, his jaw tight, his jaw muscles flexing. Harriman of state, tall and grim and gaunt, the last man in Washington to carry his greatness vigorously on from the New Deal, through the wars to the new frontier. George Ball of Stale postmaster, John Gronewski, Anthony Celebrezzi of the Cabinet, Franklin Roosevelt Jr. of Commerce. There were the grizzled leaders of Congress, Hubert Humphrey, eyes red with weeping, Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen, looking worn and weighted by years. And apart on the apron, the others, the younger men, Ted Sorensen, white of face and unapproachably solitary, Ralph Dungan and Arthur Schlesinger, bleak and sombre, McGeorge Bundy, pale and contained as usual, Fred Holborn, heads bowed, the shock covering them all. They watched the grey ambulance go. Lyndon Baines Johnson and his wife emerged and quietly, with a minimum of words, selected 3 among the many men who gathered around him. M.C. Namara of Defense, Ball of State, Bundy of the White House staff. The 3 joined the new president and his lady, and the waiting helicopter lifted them all from the field, its red lights at the rotor staff winking as it lurched its way through the sky toward the White House. John F. Kennedy loved the noble art of politics, which is the government of men. And he would have understood that now, while his body still lay in the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where his wife and brother sat vigil, the men of Washington could not help but talk of the government of the country, of those who would carry on, which ones would the new president use, which dismiss. For there are 2 parts to government, the machinery and the individuals who sit at the levers of machinery. The machinery in Washington functioned with marvelous efficiency. By noon Saturday, less than 24 hours from the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the White House had begun to change. On Thursday, the White House staff had seized Kennedy's absence to do over again the curtains, rugs, and decorations of his office. By early afternoon Friday, they had finished, and even as news of his assassination came, the staff was moving furniture back where it belonged. Saturday morning, starting at 9 a.m., all the furniture John F. Kennedy was moved out, the desk, the paintings, the decorations, his rocking chair leaving it as bare as when he entered, except for the 2 white opposing sofas by the fireplace. 3 years ago, this very month, John F. Kennedy gathered his band of Bostonians in his brother's home at the compound in Hyannisport to make a government. On the night of assassination, at his tapestried French chateau in Spring Valley, Washington, President Lyndon Johnson gathered the Southerners and Texans of his own inner circle. And by morning, it was clear that Johnson meant as certainly to govern with his own men in the White House, as had John Kennedy. Johnson's personal staff has always been far smaller, never so emotionally fused to an incandescent chief as Kennedy's staff was. But by Saturday morning, George Reedy, Johnson's spokesman, and Walter Jenkins, his chief administrative officer, and Bill Moyers, a bright young man from the Peace Corps, were installed as the first Clement of a new palace guard. Meanwhile, in the outer White House lobby, grim men came and departed. Some wept openly. Beyond, in an inner office, one who had followed John F. Kennedy from the beginning looked out over great windows, which showed Washington in the rain, and said, "I'm here because I love John Kennedy, not because I'm a Democrat. We served this man, we talked his language, we thought his thoughts. It was his magnetism, his ability, his brain that drew this remarkable group of men together." Lyndon is a man of different background, different abilities, and it is damned hard to shift. But I did not spend 10 years of my life trying to do what has been done and let it all be wiped out with one shot by some nut in Dallas. Whether it's 5 weeks or 5 years, I'm going to go on here trying as hard as I can to help. In the crowded lobby of the White House, moist with damp raincoats and crowded with sleepless men and women, the talk is mostly of people. But beyond the lobby, in the red brick homes of Georgetown, there is other, more considered talk. Talk of the future, near and far. Yesterday's unhappy vice president, whose first love was Congress, is now president. The area of Kennedy's greatest problem, the deadlock over domestic policy, is the area of Johnson's greatest strength. In the minute chronicling of the new president's every move, the city noticed at once that Johnson called together first, in the early hours of his administration, the leaders of Congress, not the executive branch. It is with these men that Johnson will seek to accomplish his own vision of the nation's future. The most consistent theme of talk was of Johnson in relation to the outer world. Said one man who has sat with Johnson, "At cabinet meetings he was silent, cautious, always taking notes. In foreign affairs, when he speaks usually on the hard-nosed side." Said another, Johnson was one of only 2 men who sat with the president on every single decision-making session of this government cabinet meetings, Security Council meetings, executive committee meetings, congressional meetings, press conference meetings. He is the most prepared president we have ever had. Johnson certainly was in a position to share Kennedy's vision of the American future. Yet the two were men who differed in pace, in timing, in taste, in attitude. On the night of Kennedy's death, Averell Harriman sat in his study and reminisced, out of that enormous memory which reaches back to the earliest days of Franklin Roosevelt. He remembered Roosevelt as a supple man, a man who enjoyed guiding his purposes and programs through the labyrinth of Congress, playing the game of persuasion. But Kennedy was different, thought Harriman. He met his Congress head-on, he locked with it, he pointed to the purposes of requested legislation, and his fights with Congress were, as a consequence, clear. Harriman's thought catches better than any other the true legacy of the Kennedy administration, the realization that this is a changing country in a changing world, and the job of the president is to force the country to recognize and face these changes. Historians will argue for a generation about the seminal legislation and proposals of the Kennedy administration. But no man in Washington who knew John Fitzgerald Kennedy well thinks that his style soon will be matched. Saturday afternoon, the gushing fall skies outside the east room of the White House made the light inside this greatest chamber of the mansion grey. The tiny golden bulbs of the great chandeliers had been dimmed to faintest candle power, and there, in the half-darkness, rose the immense hulk of a sarcophagus draped with the American flag. One filed by, and for a long moment, one lingered grief all but overpowered by the rage of frustration for all that had been only begun, and for all that was now an unfulfilled promise. One mourned for the remarkable, astringent candor so rare in public men. One thought of the night in the airplane over the skies of Montana, when Kennedy, about to challenge the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles for its nomination, was asked, "Who would the Democrats' best presidential candidate be if it could not be he himself?" And he said flatly, "Lyndon B. Johnson, the man with whom he was about to duel." One mourned for the gaiety, the elegance, the graces he and his lady had brought into this house. One mourned for a man about whom historians may long debate, arguing whether the courage shown in the confrontations with Russia was less or more memorable than the compassion shown in introducing to the American Congress its first legislation to care for the ills of age, the troubles of youth, the hopelessness of the unskilled, the humiliation of its darker citizens. One mourned because it was so still in this room, for this was a man of gallantry and of action, of motion and of the trumpet. For of all the many miles that this reporter followed John F. Kennedy on his long marches back and forth across this country, remembered best is the sound of the voice. That wonderfully clear voice so often tinged at once with sadness and the glee of combat, the voice which one night described best, for his time and his successor, the office and function of the presidency. It was election eve, the night before the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of 1960, and he had come home to Boston and was speaking at the Boston Garden, when suddenly he extended his hand, pointed the long forefinger in summons and said, "I run for the presidency of the United States, because it is the center of action, and in a free society, the chief responsibility of the president is to set before the American people the unfinished business of our country." From this grimy warehouse window ledge of the Texas School Book Depository, the assassin shot President Kennedy. Stacked book cartons, one of which still lies in the right foreground, afforded him makeshift privacy, but he perilously risked exposure by any passer-by. It is not yet known how long he waited, but police found an empty soft drink bottle, a crushed cigarette package, and gnawed remnants of fried chicken in a greasy paper bag. This photograph was taken a day later to recreate the scene. The president's car had just turned left off Houston Street, where a white ornamental fence curves at lower left, and onto Elm Street, which funnels into the triple underpass. Slowed by cornering, the car was traveling only about 15 mph when it reached the point in the center lane indicated by an arrow. At that moment, 2 loud, sharp reports were heard, and then another. Measured as snipers work, the shooting was remarkably effective. The target was moving. 75 yards from the muzzle and about 60 feet lower than the assassin, and both the president and Governor John Connolly were hit within seconds. Under the window, police found 3 spent cartridges and 1 unused. Then, hidden between stacks of books, they found the weapon, a beat-up sawed-off .30 caliber rifle of Italian make, fitted with a 4-power telescopic sight. The incredible event had an incredible sequel. Lee Harvey Oswald, held as the assassin of President Kennedy, was being taken from a Dallas jail when a man stepped up, shot, and killed him. The avenger was Jack Ruby, owner of a Dallas nightclub. The assassination of President Kennedy, the crime charged to Lee Harvey Oswald, must have been the act of a man who for a long time had harbored wild thoughts, but had kept them hidden, churning deep within himself. There was much in Lee's history, in his angry and disorganized intelligence, that would point toward the deed that would horrify the world. His father, Robert, an insurance salesman, dropped dead of a heart attack in the summer of 1939. Lee was born in October. His handsome blonde mother, Marguerite Oswald, had 2 older sons to support, besides the infant Lee, and only $3,000 from a small insurance policy, most of which went toward medical and burial bills. Times were hard, and Mrs. Oswald sold their small frame house. She began a dreary succession of badly paying jobs in New Orleans, New York, and Texas. When Lee was 5, they were living in Fort Worth, and even then he was swimming against the current. Other kids teased him because he was so bright, his mother remembered after his arrest. And near hysteria, she still summoned every ounce of a mother's will to remember only the good things about her son. He learned to read by himself, she said, before he even went to school. He was always wanting to know about important things. Teachers and classmates remember Lee as a loner, bookish and introspective, resentful of discipline. When he was about 15, a key event in his life took place. From somewhere he obtained a pamphlet about the Rosenberg spy case. It was a passionate argument that the 2 Russian spies were innocent and had been railroaded to the electric chair. "I still remember that pamphlet," he said in later years. "Then I discovered one book in the library, Karl Marx's Das Kapital. It was what I had been looking for. It was like a very religious man opening the Bible for the first time." Frequently, Lee came home with torn clothes and a bloody nose. He admitted that he had been fighting, but he would tell his mother, "You do not understand, and they do not understand." Just before his 17th birthday, he entered the 10th grade at Arlington Heights High School in Fort Worth. He was always bored and restless in school, his mother says. He used to come home and say, "I already know all the stuff they're teaching. Why bother with that?" Then he would go off to the library and read. Not trivial things. Deep stuff, histories, biographies, politics. The school could not interest him. Nowadays they have special classes for gifted students, not then. If Lee Oswald's intelligence was above average, his report cards were not. He was getting mostly C's and D's and was in danger of failing when he came home one day and told his mother that he was going to enlist in the Marine Corps. "I just want to do something different," he said. Mrs. Oswald wept as he went off. He was trained at camps in the US, then shipped to Japan as an electronics technician. His letters to his mother indicated that he was alternately content and dissatisfied with the Marines. He did not tell her that he had stood 2 courts martial, and for failing to register a pistol, the other for getting into a row with a noncom. He was a good mariner, claims Mrs. Oswald. He got the Good Conduct Medal, and he participated in that Formosa business. He fought hard for his country. Some of those who served with him, however, remember him in a different light. "We were trained to work as a team," recalled one, "but Oswald seemed to be different. He was always separate from most of the men and didn't have any close friends that I remember." Another mentions Oswald's bitterness at the tough time his mother had had when he was a small child. While Lee was in Japan, Mrs. Oswald reached up for a heavy candy carton one day in the store where she worked. The box toppled down and struck her in the head. She was in bed for 6 months and very quickly was destitute. Lee, who had by that time returned to California, with still another year to go on his hitch, obtained a special hardship discharge to provide for her. He came home for exactly 3 days. What Mrs. Oswald did not know, what nobody knew, was that a cancerous idea now totally absorbed the mind of her strange and withdrawn son. The seeds planted by the Rosenberg pamphlet had germinated. Lee had become enchanted by communism. He went to New Orleans, got a job on a freighter, and 1 month later, in October 1959, turned up in Russia, announcing that he wished to give up his American citizenship and become a Russian citizen. Marguerite Oswald learned of her son's defect when a newspaper reporter called. They said, "Your son's defected to Russia." I told them they were crazy. But then I learned it was true. I could not understand it. I can't understand anything. A correspondent named Priscilla Johnson, who was stationed in Moscow when Oswald arrived, remembered him vividly. "He was the most interesting defector I ever saw," she said. "Of the 3 or 4 defectors I saw, he was the only ideological one. He talked in terms of capitalists and exploiters, and he said something about he was sure that if he lived in the US, he would not get a job, that he would be one of the exploited. Was like a babe in the woods, a lost child." But there was more to Oswald than that, Miss Johnson found. As I talked to him, I realized he had a sort of vein in him that was beyond reason. Maybe that was fanatic. The Russians would not grant Oswald citizenship, but allowed him to stay on as a resident alien. He went to Minsk and, a year and a half later, married a pretty, blonde, hazel-eyed practicing pharmacist named Marina. While he was in Minsk, he wrote a letter that one day would be dug out of his Pentagon files and read again in a new and terrible light. He had learned that his hardship discharge from the Marines had been changed to undesirable because of his defection, and his letter of protest against the action was directed to John Connolly, who he thought was still Secretary of the Navy. There was this key phrase, "I shall employ all means to right this gross mistake or injustice." He also joined a rifle club and became an expert marksman. As a Marine, he had made only average scores. He later told a Dallas friend, "One of the things I didn't like about Russia was that the government wouldn't let you own a rifle, only shotguns, so I joined a rifle club." He was also distressed about falling hair. He said the cold Russian winters were making him bald, and he found in Russia what he had found in the US. He was still an outsider. People mistrusted him. His Russian wife was to recall. "We didn't have many friends. He actually discovered himself defending America at some parties and in conversations with fellow workers." Disenchanted, he decided to return to the United States with his wife and the daughter that had been born to them. But he had neither money nor permission. In early 1962, he wrote to his mother of his difficulties in getting out. Mrs. Oswald had by that time almost given up on her son. "But he asked me to help," she said the other day. And what mother could turn down her son? "I went to 12 prominent people in Fort Worth and begged for money, for help, for advice. They said, 'Your son's a communist. We do not want to help him.' I said, 'If a man were drowning, would you help him first, or ask his political beliefs? He made a mistake, and now he wants to rectify it.'" As has done in many similar cases, the State Department lent Oswald money to get home, and in June 1962 Lee brought his family to Fort Worth, where he joined his mother. "He did not say much about living in Russia," she said. "He just introduced his wife and baby, and said he wanted to find a job. He had an awful time getting to work. People did not like the idea of him having a Russian wife. They were awful to him and her. Finally, he got a job in a sheet metal factory, I think, but he only stayed a month or so. In late 1962, Lee got a job in a Dallas photo processing plant. His wife became pregnant again. Lee was fired from his Dallas job in April when his past became known, and he moved his family to New Orleans. They took a small apartment, and he found a similar job. For the first time in his life, he became politically active. He got involved with the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba's organization. After a street scuffle with anti-Castro elements, he was fined $10 for disorderly conduct. Later, he appeared on a local TV panel show, defending his pro-Castro sentiments. By early fall, the Oswalds were broken, and Marina was nearly ready to have their second child. She returned to Texas to stay with friends in Irving, a suburb of Dallas. Lee promised to follow as soon as he was financially able. He said he had other matters to clear up in New Orleans. Early last month, in the first week of October, Lee appeared in Dallas and telephoned his wife. "I'm going to look for a job and get someplace to live," he told her. "As soon as I'm able, we'll get the family together." He went to a red brick rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue, in nearby suburban Oak Cliff, and rented a tiny cubicle of a room. He gave his name falsely as O.H. Lee and paid a week's rent, $8 in advance. His room was hardly larger than a closet, and it was furnished sparsely: an iron single bed, painted cream with the paint peeling off, a dilapidated dresser and a closet cabinet. In the month and a half he spent at the rooming house, Lee was quiet and hardly noticed. He left every morning for work. He never told anybody where he worked, his landlady recalled. But he got up, took a bath, and he always washed the tub out, the only guest who did. Some nights he'd come out in the living room and watch TV. Mostly he had come home from work, made himself a lunch meat sandwich, and lay on his bed reading or writing. Sometimes he would make a telephone call and we would hear him talking. It was some foreign language, Russian or German or something. We always wondered who he was talking to. On weekends, Lee would go to Irving and see his wife and his 2 daughters and his friends, Mike and Ruth Payne. There he would watch the football game on TV or talk politics. The weekend before last, Lee visited his family in Irving and told them things were finally looking up. He told Marina that they would be going out soon to look for an apartment and buy Christmas presents for the children. He lifted up his infant daughter Rachel and laughed loudly. When he left to return to his tiny room and another week of work, he seemed in high spirits. That was the last Lee Harvey Oswald's wife saw of him until he was under arrest, charged with the murder of President Kennedy. Afterward, she wept and managed a few words of English. "I love Lee. Lee, good man. He didn't do anything." And his mother pointed at the television set and screamed, "My boy couldn't have killed the president. I know him. Nobody else knows him. He has been persecuted so long." But slowly, methodically, the police were building their case connecting Oswald with the mail-order purchase of a rifle like the one that fired the fatal bullet, placing him on the scene of the shooting with a long parcel the size and shape of a rifle, comparing his palm marks with one found on the murder weapon, finding traces of burned powder on his hands. Then the police turned up the most damning evidence of all. It was a snapshot of Oswald showing him holding a rifle that apparently was identical with the one that killed the president. But before the district attorney of Dallas County could demand the death penalty, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had achieved such horrifying fame, himself was dead.